In this first session, we will explore God in the 21st century. Some parables have been traditionally interpreted in ways that give us questionable, even rather violent images of God. We may wonder why we have often been so uncritical about these traditional readings. The parable of the vineyard reflects the classic social conflict of the time, economic hopelessness of an increasingly poor population and hatred for their masters. Those in desperate debt became violent people, consumed with hatred. The vineyard owner unleashes a bloodlust, and the story ends with a horrifying bloodbath. The violent vineyard owner is not an image of God, but the complete opposite of the God of the Jewish Torah and the Lord's Prayer. When Jesus told stories, he reflected real-life situations in a Roman-dominated world. His first hearers would have recognized much of what he was saying from their difficult life experiences. This particular story is of peasant revolt and an increasing spiral of violence which reflects life then and now. In this parable, the spiral of violence has three phases. Phase 1 begins in the everyday life of the poor by the ruling elites. This is often violence sanctioned and legitimized by law. Peasants may just accept it, but even they have a breaking point. Phase 2 is the stage when enough is enough and resistance grows. When livelihood and subsistence is threatened, the poor will revolt, and the story gives more detail of this phase as violence spirals. In Phase 3, the revolt, which is now turned violent, is repressed through the use of force. This is officially sanctioned violence under the pretext of safeguarding law and order or national security. It's a familiar portrayal of the spiral of violence in the world of Jesus and in much of our contemporary experience.
Jesus told his stories in a society characterized by high community levels of dire poverty, living under subsistence level and often in destitution. There were communities of debt, and in the debt-laden communities of Galilee and Judea, there were spirals of violence, and spirals of violence were frequent. And so peasant revolts occurred. Points were reached where for peasants enough was enough, and there was resistance, often violent resistance and revolt. But the problem was that these violent resistance movements and revolts were crushed by the elite power. This, of course, was the sanctioned power of the state, and the power of the state, being even more mighty and strong, would crush them. And so the story highlights three realities. One, that violence generates violence, and it spirals out of control. Two, that violence is futile as a way to change things. The futility of an armed rebellion or resistance is inevitable. And three, for the peasants and for the heirs and owners of the vineyard, they all have a similar dilemma. Are there alternative and non-violent ways to assert human dignity and human claims? If this parable of the vineyard says anything about God, and traditionally it has been made to say that God was the cause of a bloodbath and therefore violent, but if it is saying anything about God, it is that God is not violent or a tribal deity. Rather, God is anti-violence and cannot be identified with state violence or paramilitary resistance movement violence or with forms of tribal nationalism. The questions posed earlier in this session, where was God in Auschwitz? And where was God in 9/11? And where was God in the killing of the Northern Ireland problems and conflict? Such questions, and many more, are very difficult to answer. In all of the contemporary experiences of God that we considered, and to which we can add others, God did not intervene to save innocent lives. and that God did not intervene to save innocent lives raises enormous questions about our traditional images of God. In the 20th century, when millions of people lost their lives through war, genocide and violence, where millions of people lost their lives in greater numbers than all the other centuries of recorded history put together, as well as all the natural disasters, and of those millions who die from poverty and disease and hunger. The images of a supernaturalist, interventionist God and an omnipotent God, an all-powerful God, have seriously been called into question. Now, if the 20th century experience has shattered our traditional images of God, then what alternative images do we need for the 21st century? The interventionist God was fatally wounded, if we put it into historical context, fatally wounded at the Somme and died at Hiroshima. The 20th century began with great hopes of progress. We had control of technology. Life would progress and advance naturally. It also began with belief in a supernatural being who intervened and in that being's almightiness ordered history and human life. That this was an era of three great empires, it was perhaps easy enough, at least for those at the top of those empires, to believe that this God was in control in God's almightiness and powerfulness. But then again, the 20th century was the bloodiest in all of human history. And the reality of human experience was that God did not intervene. Another issue was to believe that we humans had the power, or at least God had the power of life and death in God's hands. It was God's call. But in the 20th century, it was we humans who took the power of life and death out of God's hands. We decided who would die when by industrial and technological means. And God did not intervene either in the violence in Northern Ireland between 1969 and 2004, which saw over 3,600 dead and 40,000 injured, many maimed permanently. There was no divine intervention. One of the greatest philosophers and theologians to come out of Ireland was John Eugene. That simply translates as John the Irishman. He was Irish-born, but spent most of his life in France in the court of Charles the Bold, head of the Western Empire. Eugene, in his very creative thinking, has helped us to see that when we talk about God, it may not be all that possible to do so, that God is beyond us, an incomprehensible mystery, that we cannot speak of God. Our only response is silence. John also said that in knowing ourselves and in our deepest humanity, we encounter the divine and the sacred. In other words, it is in our own experiences of life, and in our experience of others. That is where we encounter the sacred and meet God. In the mid-20th century, Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a German Lutheran pastor. He left a teaching post in New York to return to Germany during the 1930s, to stand with his people during the rise of National Socialism and Nazism, and in particular in the suffering and in the killing of Jewish people. As Bonhoeffer reflected on that experience, he came to the conclusion that only a suffering God will do. For Bonhoeffer, an almighty, all-powerful, interventionist God was already dead in his experience of Nazi Germany. And only a suffering God made any sense. A suffering God who was in solidarity with all the victims of the world, and who suffers alongside and with those victims. For Bonhoeffer, the image of God was, as for St. Paul, always cruciform, shaped by the experience of the cross.
What clues do we get from the Bible as to the nature of God? There are numerous metaphors used in the Bible to describe God. For example, God is compared to a potter, a builder, a shepherd, a midwife, and a father. The metaphors we use reveal something of how we imagine God and the qualities we attribute to God. To appreciate how these images were understood, it is important to consider their socio-political context. The context for the parable of the lost son in Luke 15 was the 1st century CE Greco-Roman world of Jesus. How might this parable have been understood in that world? And how does an understanding of that world help us make sense of this particular story? The social code in this Roman-dominated world was hierarchical and patriarchal. In other words, it was elitist top-down, and the rule of the father was considered norm. It was therefore widely believed that a male emperor as head of state and son of God was divinely ordained. And this social order was replicated in Greco-Roman households that were headed up by men. In contrast to this, the Jesus movement understood themselves as a new family that superseded the old patriarchal family. God, as Abba, took the place of a human father. The new family, therefore, was not to duplicate patriarchal relationships that operated according to a power-over model of authority. Those who wished to be great were not to lord it over each other, but were called to become like servants. Jesus, in fact, used numerous metaphors for God from within his own Jewish tradition, and these included female images for God. One such example you may be familiar with is the parable of the woman who found the lost coin. In this parable, Jesus affirms the dignity of women. Jesus did in fact tell one parable in which the character of God as Father is explicitly explored, and this was the parable of the lost son. In this particular parable, Jesus represents the fatherhood of God as a radical challenge to patriarchy. The effect of Jesus' reinterpretation is to transform the meaning of fatherhood for the Jesus movement. In this parable, the elder son embodies the patriarchal understanding of social relations. His perspective on fatherhood is the traditional one. He therefore boasts that he has been a perfect son. He has lived according to the patriarchal household code. He's served loyally, and he's never transgressed a single command of the head of the household. He has lived according to the letter of the law. The father debunks this patriarchal worldview. He rejects the traditional power over authority model of fatherhood. And his desire for his son is that the elder son see differently, that he see beyond the parameters and legalistic worldview of patriarchy. This is the new family model, where all are equal and all are included. The father urges his elder son to embrace this transformed model, to realize that all are loved and all are valued equally. The parable opens with the younger son's rebellious actions against the traditional patriarchal family setup, which held that the head of the house alone decides how the household will function, and also the roles and responsibilities everyone will assume within it. In a patriarchal world, this younger son's request to be given the right to dispose of family property while the father is still living would have been viewed as an act of dishonour and a challenge to the social order. The father concurred with the boy's rebellion. He renounced his patriarchal right to punish his younger son in his return, and this again shows us that the father had rejected the patriarchal mode of conduct. Instead, he throws a prodigal celebration to proclaim publicly his acceptance of his son. The father then, far from asserting patriarchal superiority and privilege, recognises the younger son as his equal, as an adult, and therefore capable and entitled to live his own life and make his own decisions. To the father, the son's return to the household, like his leaving, is an act of human freedom. The younger son's experience of the harshness of life with no money or food left him traumatized. The effect of this is seen on his return when he offers to give up his liberating vision and live within the traditional safe patriarchal world. But his father will not condone this backtracking. He celebrates his son's return and at the same time affirms his decision to embrace adulthood, make his own choices, and even risk failure. The father receives the boy as the son he's never ceased to be, and affirms his equality vision. The father's response reveals a God who celebrates human freedom, a God whose love is boundless and liberating. In this parable, the Divine Father, who had been understood as the ultimate justification of human patriarchy, is revealed as the one who refuses to own us, who refuses to demand our submission, and who refuses to punish our rebellion. Rather, the God we meet in this parable respects our freedom, mourns our alienation, and waits patiently for our return. This God accepts our love as pure gift. Not only does Jesus say plainly that God is not a patriarch, Jesus subverts any attempt to base human patriarchy on an appeal to God, because God alone is Father, and therefore, in the community of disciples, all are equal. This parable, then, is subversive of all domination systems, including patriarchy, and the challenge it contains continues to have relevance and prove necessary in 21st century Ireland.